There's a moment that changes everything. A moment when the woman who felt too much, who gave too much, who cared too deeply, suddenly stops. Not with anger, not with tears, not with explanations or final speeches. She just goes quiet. And that silence, that specific kind of silence, terrifies the people who took her warmth for granted. You see, the world has spent years convincing empath women that their sensitivity is a weakness, that caring deeply means you'll always forgive, that if you feel everything, you'll tolerate anything. But what they don't tell you is this: when an empath woman truly stops caring, something has died inside her that will never come back to life. Not for you. Not for the version of you she once believed in. Not ever. This isn't about holding grudges. It's not revenge. It's not even closure. It's something far more profound and far more final. It's the complete withdrawal of emotional investment. The door doesn't slam. It simply closes. And the people on the other side? They feel it immediately. Watch what happens when her energy disappears from the room. When her texts become short. When her eyes no longer search theirs for understanding. When she stops defending herself, stops explaining her feelings, stops trying to make them see her perspective. The confusion sets in first. Then the panic. They'll reach out suddenly, trying to pull her back in. They'll test her boundaries. They'll attempt the old strategies that used to work: guilt, charm, accusations of coldness, reminders of the past. But nothing lands the way it used to. Because she's not angry. She's not hurt. She's indifferent. And indifference, you'll learn, is the only emotion that can't be manipulated. You can't argue with someone who no longer cares about winning the argument. You can't guilt someone who's stopped feeling responsible for your feelings. You can't charm someone who's seen through the performance. This transformation doesn't happen overnight. It's not a choice made lightly. It's the result of 1,000 small betrayals, 1,000 moments of being misunderstood, 1,000 times her empathy was used as a weapon against her. And when it finally happens, when she stops caring, the people around her realize too late that they weren't dealing with weakness all along. They were standing in the presence of someone whose strength they never bothered to recognize until it was no longer available to them. Before the silence came years of invisible labor. The kind of work no one sees because it happens in the quiet spaces between words, in the emotional atmosphere she managed without anyone asking, in the exhaustion she carried home that had no name and no witness. She learned early how to read a room, how to sense the shift in energy when someone walked through the door, how to know, just by the tone of a voice or the rhythm of breathing, what someone needed before they even knew themselves. This wasn't a skill she chose to develop. It was survival. It was the only way to navigate a world that felt too loud, too sharp, too overwhelming without a filter. So she became the filter. For everyone else. She translated emotions that others couldn't name. When tension filled the room, she absorbed it, processed it, diffused it with the right words or the right silence. When someone was hurting, she felt it in her own chest and carried it until they felt lighter. She was the peacemaker at family gatherings, the friend who always understood, the partner who could sense what was wrong even when they said nothing was. She gave her presence, her energy, her emotional bandwidth freely, not because she had endless reserves, but because she believed that's what love looked like. That's what care required. And for years, it seemed to work. People came to her. People needed her. People told her she was special, that she had a gift, that they didn't know what they'd do without her. She held on to those words like proof that the exhaustion was worth it. That the sleepless nights spent replaying conversations, analyzing what she could have done better, worrying about everyone else's feelings, that it all mattered, that it all meant something. But here's what no one tells you about invisible labor. It only stays invisible until you stop doing it. She started noticing the patterns. How her needs always came second. How her feelings were complicated, but everyone else's feelings were valid. How when she finally spoke up about her own pain, she was met with confusion or defensiveness or the carefully delivered accusation that she was being too sensitive, too emotional, too much, too much. That phrase followed her everywhere. She was too much when she expressed hurt, but never too much when she was available at 2 a.m. Never too much when she rearranged her life to accommodate theirs. Never too much when she swallowed her own disappointment to keep the peace. She became an expert at making herself smaller, at softening her words so they wouldn't sound like criticism, at framing her boundaries as questions instead of statements, at apologizing for feelings she didn't choose to have. Because every time she tried to advocate for herself, she was reminded, directly or indirectly, that her value lay in her understanding, her patience, her ability to see everyone's perspective except, apparently, her own. The cycle became predictable. She would give. She would hope that this time it would be reciprocated. She would wait, watching for signs that someone saw her the way she saw them, deeply, fully, without condition. And then she would be disappointed. Not dramatically, not in ways she could point to and say, "This is where you hurt me." Just in the slow accumulation of moments where she realized she was holding space for people who would never think to hold space for her. And still, she stayed. Still, she gave. Because she had normalized it. She had trained herself to believe that this imbalance was just how relationships worked when you were someone who felt everything. That her internal world, so rich, so layered, so endlessly aware of nuance and meaning and unspoken truths, was supposed to remain internal. That it was selfish to expect others to meet her there. So they never did. They saw her as convenient, reliable, the one who always understood, always forgave, always made room for their complexity while keeping her own hidden. They saw her patience and mistook it for passivity. They saw her empathy and assumed it came without cost. They saw her strength in holding their pain and never once wondered what it took from her to carry it. Her inner world grew heavier with things she couldn't say, with disappointments she couldn't express without being labeled difficult, with a loneliness that existed even in crowded rooms, because no one was looking at her the way she looked at everyone else. No one was asking the questions she asked. No one was paying attention to the signs she'd been leaving for years, that she was tired, that she was hurting, that she needed someone to see her without her having to perform or explain or justify her existence. She gave and gave and gave, and the world simply learned to expect it. Until one day, she had nothing left to give. And that's when everything changed. The breaking point didn't announce itself. There were no grand confrontations, no final explosive arguments, no dramatic declarations of being done. It happened quietly, in an ordinary moment that could have been any other moment in the years of invisible labor she'd performed. Except this time, something inside her simply stopped trying. It wasn't one betrayal that did it. It was the 10,000th paper cut. The casual dismissal that would have once sent her spiraling into self-doubt now landed differently. She felt it, recognized it, and then something unexpected happened. She didn't try to fix it, didn't rush to smooth it over, didn't apologize for being hurt or rationalize why they didn't mean it that way. She just let it sit there, unresolved, and realized the world didn't end. That's when the shift began. For years, she had operated on a belief system that required her constant emotional management to keep relationships alive. She thought if she could just explain herself better, communicate more clearly, show up more consistently, then people would finally understand her value. She carried the weight of every misunderstanding as if it were her failure to translate her heart into language others could receive. But in that quiet moment of breaking, she realized something that changed everything. Some people understood her perfectly. They just didn't care. The explanation stopped first. She had spent years defending her feelings, justifying her boundaries, providing context for why something hurt her. She had written long messages trying to help people see her perspective. She had stayed up late replaying conversations, searching for the exact right words that would make them finally get it. But when she stopped, when she simply let people misunderstand her without correcting the record, she discovered a devastating truth. Most of them weren't confused. They were comfortable with the version of her that required no accountability from them. Then came the clarity. Painful, sharp, undeniable clarity. She started seeing patterns she had been too close to recognize before. The people who only reached out when they needed something. The ones who disappeared when she was struggling but expected her full presence during their crises. The friends who trauma dumped without asking if she had capacity, but went silent when she needed to be heard. The ones who praised her empathy but punished her boundaries. The ones who called her strong when she was serving them and called her cold when she started serving herself. She saw how her empathy had been weaponized. How people had learned exactly which emotional buttons to push to keep her engaged, to keep her giving, to keep her second-guessing herself. They knew she would always try to see their side, always extend grace, always make room for their humanity. And they used that knowledge not to love her better, but to avoid accountability altogether. Her kindness wasn't respected. It was exploited. What she had called love was often just her own desperate need to be chosen by people who had already shown her, in 100 quiet ways, that she wasn't their priority. She had mistaken breadcrumbs for meals, had called inconsistency complexity, had labeled emotional unavailability as just their personality. She had done the mental gymnastics required to turn their bare minimum into something she could live on. And she had called that understanding, called it maturity, called it unconditional love. But it wasn't love. It was self-betrayal. The psychological shift happened at the identity level. She stopped seeing herself through the lens of how useful she could be to others. Stopped measuring her worth by her ability to absorb their chaos and return peace. Stopped believing that caring deeply meant caring indiscriminately. Emotional detachment, she learned, wasn't cruelty. It was self-preservation. It was the boundary between empathy and self-destruction. She began pulling back her energy, not as punishment, but as protection. The people who noticed got defensive, called her distant, said she'd changed, accused her of being cold, unforgiving, not the person they knew. And they were right. She had changed. She was no longer willing to pour herself into people who treated her like a resource instead of a human being. She was no longer available for relationships where she did all the emotional labor and got called difficult the moment she asked for reciprocity. The ones who truly cared, the ones who had actually been showing up all along, didn't panic at her boundaries. They respected them. They adjusted. They met her where she was without demanding she return to who she used to be. But those people were rare. And the realization of just how rare they were hurt in a way that nothing else had. This was the breaking point. Not the destruction of her capacity to care, but the death of her willingness to care for people who had never cared back. Pain didn't make her bitter. It made her wise. It made her selective. It taught her that the deepest form of self-love is refusing to betray yourself for people who would never protect you the way you protected them. And once she learned that lesson, there was no going back. The transformation didn't announce itself with speeches or ultimatums. There were no grand declarations of new boundaries, no explanations of what had changed. She simply became different. And the people around her felt it immediately, even if they couldn't name what they were feeling. She stopped being reactive in the ways they had come to expect. The emotional buttons they used to push, guilt, obligation, the reminder of who she used to be, no longer worked. She didn't defend herself when they accused her of changing, didn't justify her distance when they called her cold, didn't rush to reassure them when her boundaries made them uncomfortable. She just let their discomfort exist without trying to manage it. And that, more than anything, revealed how much of her energy had been spent protecting other people from the consequences of their own behavior. Her boundaries appeared quietly, like walls that had always been there, but were only now visible. She didn't announce them because she no longer needed permission to enforce them. When someone crossed a line, she didn't explain why it was a line or give them a chance to argue their intentions. She simply created distance. No drama, no anger, just space. And in that space, she reclaimed something she had been giving away for years, her peace. The silence became her most powerful tool. Not the silence of suppressed rage or swallowed hurt, but the silence of complete indifference. She stopped chasing closure from people who would never give it. Stopped waiting for apologies that weren't coming. Stopped hoping that if she just communicated one more time, they would finally understand. She realized closure was something she could give herself, and it didn't require their participation. Her old self would have fought for the relationship, would have bent herself into shapes that hurt just to keep the connection alive, would have over-explained her feelings, trying to make people see her humanity, trying to earn the empathy she had given so freely. She was always eager to fix, to heal, to bridge gaps, to translate emotions until everyone felt understood. She made herself small in conflicts, swallowed her needs to keep the peace, and called that maturity. But this version of her? She was done shrinking, done translating, done performing emotional labor for people who never once considered what it cost her. She became discerning in a way that looked like coldness to people who had benefited from her lack of boundaries. She practiced what psychologists call selective empathy, the conscious choice to reserve emotional energy for people who honored it. She understood now that empathy without discernment is just self-destruction with good intentions. That feeling everything doesn't mean you have to carry everything. That you can understand someone's pain without making it your responsibility to fix. This was emotional sovereignty. The reclamation of her inner world as her own territory, not a public space where anyone could enter and leave their chaos behind. She became the gatekeeper of her own energy, and most people didn't pass the gate anymore. The people who had taken her for granted responded with confusion first. They couldn't understand why their old tactics stopped working, why she no longer engaged in circular arguments, why she didn't defend herself against their mischaracterizations, why she could hear their criticism and simply not care whether they approved of her choices. They were used to a version of her that needed their validation, that feared their disapproval, that would exhaust herself trying to make them see her worth. But she didn't need them to see it anymore. She saw it herself, and that changed everything. They tried guilt, reminded her of the past, of who she used to be, of promises she'd made back when she didn't know that some promises require you to betray yourself. She didn't take the bait. They tried charm. Sudden attention after months of neglect, love bombing after years of breadcrumbs, compliments designed to pull her back into the role of emotional caretaker. She recognized the pattern and didn't engage. They tried anger. Called her cold, selfish, unforgiving, not the person they thought she was. She agreed. She wasn't that person anymore, and she didn't apologize for it. The discomfort they felt was the discomfort of losing access to something they never valued until it was gone. They weren't mourning her. They were mourning the supply, the constant emotional availability, the unpaid therapy, the free pass on accountability, the safety of knowing that no matter how they treated her, she would always try to understand, always make excuses for them, always be there. She was no longer there. Not in the way they wanted. Not in the way that required her to disappear so they could remain comfortable. Her energy, once scattered across dozens of people who gave nothing back, became concentrated, focused, protected. She built her life around people who didn't need to be taught how to respect her, who didn't require her to prove her worth through service, who showed up without being chased, who valued her presence as much as she valued theirs. And for the ones who didn't make the cut, she felt nothing. No anger, no bitterness, no need for revenge or the final word. Just indifference. The kind of indifference that comes not from hardness, but from clarity. She had finally learned the difference between people who loved her and people who loved what she did for them. She had stopped being available to those who only wanted her when it was convenient. Stopped explaining herself to those who were determined to misunderstand her. Stopped giving chances to people who had already shown her exactly who they were. The transformation was complete. And the woman who emerged from those years of invisible labor, from that quiet breaking point, from that painful clarity, she was someone entirely new. Someone they could no longer manipulate. Someone who had finally chosen herself. For years, the world told her that her sensitivity was a flaw. That feeling deeply meant being weak. That empathy made her an easy target, destined to be hurt, used, and discarded by people who operated without the burden of a conscience. She almost believed it. Almost internalized the idea that the very thing that made her human was the thing that made her vulnerable. But something shifted when she paired that sensitivity with discernment. When she stopped offering her empathy to everyone and started protecting it like the rare resource it was. That's when she discovered the truth they never tell you. Empathy isn't weakness. Empathy without boundaries is weakness. But empathy with discernment? That's a superpower. She still felt everything. Still picked up on the micro-expressions, the shifts in energy, the unsaid words hanging in the air. But now, instead of absorbing it all and making it her problem, she simply observed. She read people faster than they could perform for her. Detected lies the moment they left someone's lips, not because she was paranoid, but because her system had been trained by years of being lied to. She saw through manipulation effortlessly, recognized the patterns before they could fully form. The difference was this. Her emotional intelligence was no longer a wound. It was a shield. She knew when someone was love-bombing her because she'd seen the cycle before. Knew when someone was testing her boundaries because she recognized the language of entitlement. Knew when someone's apology was real versus when it was just a strategy to regain access. Her sensitivity, which had once made her vulnerable to every emotional predator who sensed her willingness to understand, now made her untouchable. Because she understood them better than they understood themselves. And she was no longer interested in saving people from their own patterns. Here's the paradox that confused everyone. She felt more now, not less. Her emotional range hadn't shrunk. Her capacity for depth hadn't diminished. But she shared less. Reserved her feelings for people who had earned the privilege of witnessing them. She wasn't cold. She was selective. She wasn't bitter. She was wise. She had simply learned to stop handing her heart to people who were only going to use it as a doormat. This is what quiet power looks like. Not loud. Not aggressive. Not proving anything to anyone. Just the calm, unshakable presence of someone who has nothing left to prove and no one left to convince. She could sit in a room full of chaos and remain centered. Could listen to someone's drama without taking it on. Could witness manipulation attempts without feeling the need to call them out or fix the person trying to use her. She learned to stay calm while others spiraled. Learned that she didn't owe anyone her emotional labor just because they were struggling. Learned that watching someone self-destruct without intervening wasn't cruelty. It was allowing them to face the natural consequences of their choices. She had spent years being the safety net for people who kept jumping off cliffs. Now she simply stepped aside and let them learn what gravity felt like. Walking away became easier. Not because she stopped caring, but because she finally cared about herself more. She didn't need the last word. Didn't need to make them understand. Didn't need closure or validation or acknowledgement of how they'd wronged her. She could just leave. Mid-conversation. Mid-relationship. Mid-expectation. And the freedom in that was something she'd never experienced before. This version of her was unshakable. You couldn't guilt her back into old patterns by reminding her of who she used to be. Couldn't charm her with sudden attention after months of neglect. Couldn't manipulate her with tears or anger or silent treatment. She'd seen every tactic. Had used her empathy to understand exactly why people behaved the way they did. And that understanding didn't make her more sympathetic. It made her more committed to protecting herself from them. Empty words bounced off her now. The "I miss you" texts from people who never made time for her. The "you're so strong" compliments from people who only noticed her strength when they needed something carried. The "I'm sorry" messages that never came with changed behavior. She heard the words, acknowledged them, and kept moving, because she had finally learned that words without action are just noise, and she was done letting noise dictate her reality. Guilt trips that would have once sent her into a spiral of self-doubt now barely registered. When someone accused her of being selfish for having boundaries, she agreed. Yes, she was selfish with her energy now. Selfish with her time. Selfish with her empathy. And she had never been healthier. She understood that in a world that had trained her to pour from an empty cup, selfishness wasn't a character flaw. It was survival. The hardest lesson, the one that took years of pain to learn, was this: not everyone deserves access to your energy. Not everyone has earned the right to your understanding. Not everyone is worthy of your empathy. And withdrawing it from people who misused it isn't cruel. It's necessary. She had been taught that love meant unlimited chances. That forgiveness meant letting people hurt you repeatedly. That empathy required her to understand everyone, even at the expense of understanding herself. But she knew better now. Real love has standards. Real forgiveness doesn't require you to keep someone in your life. Real empathy includes having empathy for yourself, which means protecting yourself from people who drain you. Her strength wasn't in her ability to endure mistreatment anymore. It was in her ability to recognize it early and remove herself before it cost her peace. She was no longer the woman who stayed because she was strong enough to handle it. She was the woman who left because she was strong enough to know she deserved better, and that made her someone they could never manipulate again. This is who she became. Calm in rooms that used to unsettle her. Grounded in a sense of self that no longer required external validation. Sovereign over her own energy, her own time, her own heart. She stopped seeking closure from people who would never give it. Stopped waiting for apologies that weren't coming. Stopped hoping that one day they'd realize what they lost. Because she realized what she gained. She built a life where peace wasn't the exception, it was the standard. Where her energy wasn't scattered across people who gave nothing back. Where silence wasn't loneliness, but sanctuary. Where her sensitivity became her strength, and her boundaries became her freedom. When an empath woman stops caring, people call it a loss. But it's not. It's a reclamation. She's not heartless. She's healed. She's not cold. She's protected. She's not closed off to love. She's just no longer open to disrespect disguised as connection. And once she crosses that line, once she fully understands her worth and stops negotiating it with people who never valued it, there's no going back. You can't re-break someone who's already put themselves back together. You can't manipulate someone who's learned all the games. You can't guilt someone who's made peace with choosing themselves. If this resonates with you, if you felt this shift or you're in the middle of it right now, I want you to know your peace matters more than their comfort. Subscribe if these insights speak to you. And remember, the moment you stop giving your energy to people who never valued it is the moment your life truly begins. Some transformations are irreversible, and this is one of them.